For centuries, our relationship with weeds was one of peaceful coexistence. We tolerated them in our gardens and fields as part of the natural order. Weeds can be useful to us as well as beautiful. But they're more than that. They are a vital resource for insects and wildlife. They can help us unlock mysteries about the entire plant kingdom. And they're key to maintaining the most basic processes of life on Earth. Having worked as a professional gardener for the last 20 years in places such as Kew Gardens, Edinburgh Botanics and Westminster Abbey, I've fought a low-level war against those plants which I condemn as weeds. In fact, I probably condemned thousands and thousands of plants to the compost bin over the last 2 decades. But now I'm starting to wonder what turned me against them in the first place. After all, we've always made good use of them in natural remedies.
It's used for joint problems, for arthritis and rheumatism.
Today's problems really started when we began to bring in non-native wild plants from abroad. Many of these plants looked pretty appealing at first, but there was one small problem. And this is one of the most invasive species in Britain today. And each one of these racemes is capable of producing hundreds of seed. We ended up throwing everything we could into the fight against weeds. A battle I've been part of myself.
Applying a poisonous emulsion, it can work up to 40 acres a day.
But ultimately, it's a war I will lose, as these hardy, opportunistic plants have the most inventive ways to make sure they survive in the natural world. In turning them into enemies, we forgot what they can be like as friends.
We just see them as vegetable trash.
Make me sick. They're like maggots or vultures. There's more and more all the time.
It's time to repair our relationship with these humble but essential plants before it's too late. In the last 50 years, there's been an all-out war on weeds. The weeds have got tougher, and so have the weapons. It wasn't always like this. Out in the countryside, weeds, if they weren't exactly our mates, they were part of the natural order. Most people thought weeds were just something we'd live with since we got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But then something came along which made weeds feel very unwelcome. Gardens. Once gardening was a pastime only for the aristocracy. But in the 19th century, new red brick terraces sprang up across Victorian England, and they all came with their own little garden. For the first time, every British man and woman could control nature for artistic effect. The chance to impose order on the natural world really caught on. And now no one loves their gardens more than we do. This is our own precious patch of ground, where weeds are strictly not invited. We've been firmly told there's no room anywhere for weeds.
These are the seeds of annual weeds. They're going to compete with my seedlings for light and moisture, unless I do something about it.
But what we haven't been told is that the more we struggle to keep them out, the more the weeds will come back. They move in like an invading army. They are plants that thrive where we least want them. We think of them as intruders from an alien world.
Monster plants on the march.
The irony is there'd be no such thing as weeds without our very efforts to get rid of them. And it's taken me a long time to realise why. My personal relationship with weeds started with my formal training. When I was a student here at Edinburgh Botanics, I was sent out to defend this beautiful collection of plants. And one of my foes was this little chap here, Cardamine hirsute, or the bittercress. And I begrudgingly admired this plant because I'd get my tweezers and I'd put this plant out of the ground. But as I did it, I found out this plant had an exploding seed head. So it was almost, as I pulled it out and the seed shot everywhere, it was saying to me, I'll see you next week. When I left Edinburgh, weeds were still my enemies. And it wasn't until I took over at Westminster Abbey that I started to see things differently. Although weeds may seem like the lower orders, they're not going to be pushed around by anyone. When I first came here as head gardener, following in the footsteps of 9 centuries of gardeners, I knew Westminster Abbey was a special place. And the first real event I was to experience was a celebration of the victory of the Battle of Britain, where the great and the good came along, a sovereign, lords and ladies, the Knights of the Order of the Bath, politicians, and the veterans who helped fight for our liberty. In such esteemed company, I developed an obsession with weeding. The truth is that the more we try to get rid of them, the more they come back. That's what they do. What I learned when I was here is that weeds are rebels. They adhere to no boundaries, they conform to no rules, and the fact that they did that within the very walls of the establishment itself led me to have a great sense of admiration for them. To me, weeds' willingness to grow everywhere and anywhere represents regeneration and new life. Surely something to be celebrated. I think we've forgotten what a weed is and what it does, what makes it so special. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. What is a weed? Surely there must be an official definition. Gardener's Question Time organic gardener Bob Flowerdew has always championed the virtues of the plants most people think of as useless weeds.
Well, all the textbooks will say a weed is a plant in the wrong place, which is fairly true. You just don't want them. They're not as pretty as the flowers that you want to cultivate, or they're not as productive. You think, you know, would you rather have carrots or would you rather have the weeds choking them all? You want the carrots. Weeds are this potential resource.
Yeah.
Most, in fact, all of our garden plants were once weeds. They were wild plants. And we've improved them, first by giving them better culture and by selection.
So botanically, there's no such thing as a weed.
No, there's no difference. It is just a plant that we haven't discovered the virtues of yet.
Well, you know, Bob, when I started gardening, I remember it on the parks, it was very meticulous. I had to prune the hybrid tea roses, and I had to edge the green, and I had to stripe the lawn. Do you think that attitudes to weeds have changed a lot? We've become a lot more relaxed about them.
No, there's a time and place for everything, and some people love it. A spick and span garden, it's super neat. However, they won't have as many butterflies, hoverflies, and other interesting things because they haven't got those resources there. They also will have bare soil. They'll have to buy in fertiliser. You know, I mean, you know, it's bizarre, but really they're throwing away the thing that makes fertility for free.
So they have a place in your garden then, Bob?
Oh, yes, very much so.
There are over 40 different definitions of a weed, but none of them is definitive. They're all really just descriptions of our attitudes to weeds, not botanical categories. Calling a weed unattractive or unwanted makes sense if you're a suburban gardener, but not if you want to look at the plant kingdom as a whole. Richard Maybe has been writing about wild plants and weeds for the last 30 years.
Well, there have been masses of definitions. America, a weed is defined as any wild plant which grows 6 inches above the ground in anyone's garden, and it's illegal. Somebody, an American writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, said a weed is simply a plant for which a use has not yet been discovered. The most popular one is that a weed is a plant in the wrong place, but that means somebody's got to decide what the right place is.
Keen to show me an example of the difference between a right place and a wrong place, Richard took me to the ruins of the 12th century abbey at Bury St Edmunds.
There's a very graphic illustration of the extent to which There are minute differences in what can be the right and wrong place for a plant. Here we've got Aubrietia, which for a start is in the wrong place in two ways. It's a native wildflower of southern Europe, brought into this country as a rockery plant, has escaped onto the walls of the abbey, where it's tolerated only if it's about 5 feet above the ground. And if you come down here, there the Aubrietia has been the subject of weed killer spray. It injects so much subjective opinion into it. I mean, some people, if they get bluebells in their garden, which, you know, are wild bluebells coming in from the outside, regard them as a weed because they should stay in the woods where they belong. And conservationists regard the Spanish bluebell, a slightly bigger, more aggressive sort that people grow in the gardens, when that gets out, gets into woods and hybridizes with the English bluebell, that's a weed. So there's enormous kinds of social and convention and even fashion which come into this definition.
If the definition of a weed just depends on fashion, then you can bet that what counts as a weed and what doesn't has changed again and again over the last 300 years. In fact, the story of our changing attitude to weeds is really the story of our changing attitudes to civilization and nature. In the 18th century, buccaneering plant hunters set sail in search of new non-native wild plants. One of their prized discoveries was Senecio squaladis, commonly known as Oxford ragwort, and today a confirmed pest. It had started life as a native wildflower on the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily, where it had thrived on the volcanic clinker. It was brought to England and arrived in Oxford in the 1700s, where it was studied carefully. Its first recorded point of arrival was here at the Botanic Gardens in Oxford, hence its name. And the seed was either brought in by collectors or snuck in on the root ball of one of the many plants being collected around the world at the time. It was recorded by Joseph Banks, the great 18th century plantsman, as growing within the garden quite happily in the 1770s. By the turn of the century, the seeds had found their way into the walls, the lime of the mortar suiting their taste for a high pH. But it wasn't long before the plant escaped and spread throughout Britain. The seeds wafted over the walls, down the lanes and past the colleges, past the Sheldonian Theatre. By 1830, the plant had arrived at Oxford railway station. The dry, rocky shingle, used as a ballast along the railway line, soon became a home from home for the newly escaped ragwort, mimicking perfectly the conditions the plant would have enjoyed in its native land. As well as getting on board via the soles of passengers' shoes, the seeds were also carried along by the train's slipstream. And as a result of all this help from the wind, trains and humans, Oxford ragwort spread quickly around the entire railway network. But if the 18th century was the great age of plant hunting in the name of science, by the 19th century, our attitude had changed again. Victorian plant hunters were looking above all for colour and drama, and they didn't worry about what mischief the plant might do when brought back to the temperate, accommodating climate of Britain.
Any idea of what it is?
No, not really. Foreign import of some sort I know not what of.
Little did they know that many of the plants prized for their beauty would years later be vilified as pests. And when exotic plants were brought back from abroad by our 18th century forebears, no one gave a thought to the effect they might have on our native species. Three plants in particular, highly prized as new ornamental blooms in the 19th century, have now been officially blacklisted as plant pariahs, to be hunted down and exterminated. And each of them tells us something different about our changing relationship with weeds. Buddleia davidii, or the butterfly bush, came from China, The first of these aggressive plants brought into Britain that have since escaped from our gardens, preferring to find places that remind them of their native land. And this is one of the most invasive species in Britain today. And each one of these racemes is capable of producing hundreds of seed. A plant like this produces thousands, each one capable of germinating in ballast, mortar, or even concrete. Like Oxford ragwort, Buddleia feels completely at home along the rocky railway tracks, where it has spread the length and breadth of the country. Preventing these plants damaging any of the thousands of miles of Britain's railway lines is a costly process for Network Rail. So, Neil, big weed problem. How much is it costing?
To deal with the weeds on the track, sending a train around the network every year, £3 to £4 million. To deal with all the vegetation on the network, dangerous trees and the weeds, £30 to £40 million.
And I suppose one of your biggest problems is going to be the species Buddleia, isn't it?
Yes.
So, Neil, I know these plants come from China, where they're like lime cliff faces. Is there a connection between why they're so successful here?
I think it must be. The retaining walls that we have a lot of lime mortar holding the bricks together, and the plant must just, the pH must be just right for the seeds to germinate, and then they thrive in those areas.
Well, Neil, you can't pull that out. That's solid in the ground. Yep. How would you go around attacking that plant?
It'd be a chemical treatment. For the small plants, we would just use a leaf application herbicide, the spots treatment, so it's actually just dealing with that one plant. For the larger ones, we're looking at a new technique where we actually cut the stumps, and then rather than putting a application of herbicide onto the stump itself, because you can get issues with runoff. So what we're looking at is a new system using these plugs, whereby you drill a hole into the stump itself to a known depth. You then hammer it in. This then splits the casing, and then that herbicide dissolves directly into the sap of the tree or the Buddleia, and that gets straight into the system.
So it's very targeted pesticide, isn't it? And that means that that's systemic, isn't
it?
Yes, yeah. So when the chemical's released, it goes straight into the vascular bundle,
yep,
which poisons the entire plant,
yes,
right down at the root, nothing left.
Nothing left, and all being well, what it means is because it's very good at killing the whole plant, we don't have to come back, which improves the safety because the guys are only having to go there once. They're not going up to height on the mobile platforms, and it's done.
So that is the magic bullet.
It's the targeted application of the pesticide to the plants to kill that plant, yes. Yeah, it's great.
Magic bullets are all well and good, but we're fighting a losing battle here. The Buddleia is always likely to get the upper hand, and it doesn't even know it's in a war. So the Buddleia is a plant only doing what comes totally naturally to it. It's a survivor. And if we've got problems with it, well, maybe that's down to us. Despite our best efforts, Buddleia has found a comfortable niche in the overlooked spaces of our cities. It's a garden escapee that has got above itself, and for some reason we've decided we can't tolerate it living beyond our backyards. It's not just in towns that fashions have changed. In one of the most remote and rural parts of Britain, the Isle of Bute in Argyll, another much-loved Victorian bloom has been reclassified as a menace to society. Scotland has thousands of square miles of forest, from the millions of acres of forestry commissioned spruce to the ancient pines of Glen Affric, remnants of the Caledonian forest. And thanks to our Victorian forefathers, a very un-Celtic plant is spreading unchecked, fit to choke the glens, say its critics. It's Rhododendron Ponticum, and it's roused the ire of the Scots. One of the most invasive weeds in Britain today, it came from the northwest of Spain in the 1840s. At the time, it would have been a gardener's delight, with its thick waxy leaves, its spreading and ground cover habit, and its sprays of purple flower in the summer. And it wasn't just Victorian gardeners who embraced the plant. Rich landowners snapped it up as part of their impressive botanical collections. On shooting estates in Scotland and Wales, Rhododendron Ponticum was introduced to provide ground cover for game birds. This was a fatal mistake. The most common rhododendron in Britain, it spreads at the expense of almost all other species. In Argyll, it can climb the ancient oaks and block the light so essential for the lichen and moss. Each plant produces millions of seeds. And Ponticum even uses chemical warfare to conquer all that surrounds it. It releases poison from its roots that knocks out anything that dares to compete. The plants are host to Phytophthora, a fungus-like mould genus, implicated in the tree disease known as sudden oak death. Gordon Gray-Stevens from Scottish Natural Woodland knows what it's like to be at the sharp end of this war against Rhododendron Ponticum in Argyll. What proportion of the county is actually covered in rhododendron?
Well, Forestry Commission did a survey about 3 years ago now, and a partial survey of Argyll, and they came out with somewhere over 3,000 hectares of ground infested with rhododendron. The rhododendron casts such a dense shade that the oak can't seed into that dense mat of rhododendron. So in 400 or 500 years' time, we won't have an oak woodland left. We'll just have a ponticum thicket. So in the long term, that will happen. But in the short term, it destroys the ground layer. So there's nothing left growing on the ground underneath the ponticum. All you have is just leaves and bare ground. So that makes a real difference to a lot of these lower plants. The root can be on ground which is favourable to ponticum, and the layers will go away into wet ground where it wouldn't normally survive, but because it's got its roots, its main root on the dry land, it can spread into areas where it otherwise wouldn't be able to get to. It's like a Swiss Army knife of a plant, I suppose. Well, the cost of treating it is quite substantial, so this is labour-intensive. It's hard work for people to get in there and clear rhododendron. And the Forestry Commission at that stage reckoned it would cost £9 million to clear Argyll rhododendron at that stage in 2007. But the other dramatic figure is that by 2050, if we don't do anything, it'll cost £50 million. So the stuff is spreading so quickly that not doing something about it now means we'll have a far bigger problem later on.
The only way to tackle the problem effectively is by gathering a group of committed volunteers.
If we could see the last 100 years of rhododendron expanding through Scotland, it would appear as an army, just advancing all the time, up the hills, up the glens. It just gets bigger and bigger.
And how would you physically attack it?
We tried to get them out by the roots as much as possible, so that way the plant that's it, finished. All that might survive are seedlings, which will come up over the next few years. And, yeah, knock it back as hard as we can in the first pass. You need a vigorous approach for a plant that is so vigorous. It is a bit of a battle. You need a team, really. One man on his own standing underneath that is a bit daunting, but even two people, you can go, right, I'll start here and you start there, and you can work into it. But the more people you've got in a team, the bigger your army is against the army of rhododendron. You engage every part of your body, you get battered and scratched and bruised, but it's beautiful.
So it's obviously at the end of each day you can look back and see what you've achieved, really. But I like the idea that they don't go quietly.
No, they don't go quietly. They fight back every time, Roddies. And so at the end of the day, you know you've been at war for a day. You know you've been fighting. Here it comes.
But again, there is more than meets the eye to our relationship with roadies. Rhododendron Ponticum may once have flourished in Britain before the glaciers came 20,000 years ago. And maybe that's why it thrives here today. It's only our decision to classify it as an alien that leads us into battle against it. And when something does get labelled alien, then an entire industry will spring up, dedicated to its destruction. Never was that truer than with the introduction of one very special foreign beauty. Introduced into Britain by Philippe von Seebold, a German biologist in the early 19th century, this fast-growing plant, producing big white flowers in the summer, quickly became a gardener's favourite. Well, I'm here amongst a strand of Japanese knotweed, and it really is like a jungle in here. It's completely conquered the surrounding ground. And it's hard to believe at one time this was a much sought-after ornamental, and an expensive one at that, and was very prized in Victorian gardens. And you can see why. It's got many qualities. First off, it's pollution resistant, it grows in poor soil, and it's also very fast-growing, can put on 5 foot in 4 weeks. And speaking as a gardener, I can understand why they prized it so much. In fact, in 1879, the Horticultural Journal of the Garden described it as one of the most beautiful herbaceous plants in civilization. How reputations are lost. Today, it's turned into the most aggressive alien weed in Britain, an outlaw we've decided to hunt down without mercy. True, this is no ordinary weed. It outcompetes everything around it. The plant's complex root system, as we gardeners call it, rhizome, spreads up to 20 feet in all directions, as well as going down 9 feet below the surface. And just for good measure, the roots can swell and throttle entire root systems of other species. And these plants don't just grow downwards. Above ground, they can grow over 20 feet a year and rapidly swamp any vegetation in their path. But there is a dirty little secret in our relationship with knotweed. The most amazing thing about this plant is it's never propagated by seed. In fact, it's human beings that spread it. Let me show you the secret of knotweed's success. And it's this rhizome here. If I break a little piece of this off and take it away with me, I'd spread the plant. It can penetrate concrete and completely envelop a house. Japanese knotweed is now posing a problem to homeowners in the UK. Some high street banks are refusing mortgages on properties infected with the weed. And removing it is difficult. Not only is there the sheer mass of plant and root to remove, but the soil is treated as controlled waste. So a giant weed control industry has grown up along with the knotweed, and the two are now locked in mortal combat. It's a lucrative business, worth a staggering £1.5 billion per year in the UK. To clear the new London Olympic site alone cost one contractor £9 million. Clearing building land is a big part of the knotweed removal industry. So what do you have to do to get rid of it?
You have to erect a fence to prevent humans entering the area and causing what we call cross-contamination, so spreading it around. We'd basically apply the herbicide to the plant. It can in fact take up to 3 to 5 years and require several applications per year, if not more. The second thing is then to cut and clear absolutely all of the surface growth. We'd basically then put it in a designated area and then incinerate it, usually in a cage incinerator. And that's to prevent any small fragments being dispersed around the rest of the site where it could potentially regenerate into new infestations.
You deal with the soil, so this would be classed as a toxin, would it, or...?
It's classed as controlled waste, which is contaminated with active Japanese knotweed rhizome.
So it's a bit of a worry if you did build on it and you didn't get rid of it all, that maybe people have knotweed coming through their front room?
Literally, yeah, that does happen on certain cases.
So getting rid of it would be quite expensive, yeah?
Yeah, there's some horrific statistics out there. You know, if we were to eradicate all Japanese knotweed now, it would cost things like £2 billion.
The thing is, we've brought all this on ourselves by bringing in non-native species to an environment where they could spread without natural predators. The knotweed removal industry is here to stay, partly thanks to government tax breaks. But there is an arms race going on here, and we're never going to win it by developing bigger and better weapons. It's time to come up with a new plan. One man thinks he has the answer. Part of the reason Japanese knotweed flourishes in Britain is because it has no natural enemies here. But in Japan, where as you might expect, the plant is common, it doesn't rage out of control, thanks to the insects that keep it in check. 10 years ago, plant scientist Dick Shaw began an epic quest to find a natural way of controlling knotweed in the UK. His first port of call was Japan's native insects. He tested various bugs that fed off the weed before selecting a psyllid as the best control agent. A creature with an appetite for Japanese knotweed and little else. I'm really interested to how it attacks it. Why does it set about attacking the knotweed?
Well, it's called a psyllid. It's a tiny little sapsucker, and the adult female lays all the eggs, up to 600 per adult, and the eggs hatch, and then the nymphs are what hatch out the eggs, and they go through various stages. But all the stages, they suck the sap out of the plant, just like a bunch of aphids. If you have a load of aphids on your plants at home, you know what damage they can cause. Well, our psyllid attacks this plant only, and it causes stumpier leaves, shorter plants, and hopefully a less aggressive and invasive species in the end.
After battling suspicious authorities in Britain, who quarantined his bugs for several years, Dick finally got clearance last year from the government to release them in Britain. This is the first time that biocontrol has ever been used in Europe to fight a weed. This climate-controlled greenhouse is a psyllid breeding colony, where generations of the bugs are being raised to do their duty by devouring our Japanese knotweed.
We need an awful lot of knotweed to feed an awful lot of psyllids, so that's pretty much the beginning of our mass production process.
So this is a pantry by all intents and purposes?
Exactly, a pantry with only one food source on the menu.
And are there insects? Are there psyllids here now?
No, there's nothing on these plants. These are all clean, ready to be fed to the psyllids, and once they've got to a suitable size, then they're perfect for feeding.
So this is almost like a supermarket, so I'm guessing that this little contraption here, this little incubator here, is where our friends the psyllids are?
Yeah, this is their dining room. They feed on the plants in here. Once we introduce them, go through their cycle, and we end up with more psyllids out at the end than we had at the beginning, and that's the mass production process. This is just about getting as many psyllids produced as possible so that we can get them out into the field.
So that must be quite an exciting moment for you, is it?
Yeah, it's the culmination of a lot of work. An awful lot of scientists around the world have been involved in this, and yeah, I hope it's a triumphant return. Well, what you can see here is that we're lucky. There's a couple of adults mating here, female and male, and there's another interested male coming down the mid-vein of the plant. And this is exactly what we want them to do. And then you can see, with any luck, you can probably see some of the eggs on the surface of the leaf, the tiny white dots of the progeny. I know there's 3 there, aren't there?
This extra psyllid seems to have turned insect reproduction into an 8-legged carry-on film.
There's another one in there now.
This is the equivalent of a disco dance floor with 1 bird and 3 geezers.
She's very popular. A very frustrated male charging around the leaf now with his bottom lip hanging out.
Dick's return to organic methods of dealing with weeds fits with the present-day revival of ancient folklore about the use of weeds in herbal remedies. Today, 10 million of us spend a total of £240 million on herbal cures derived from weeds.
Looks like a big cow parsley.
And as a medical herbalist, Dee Atkinson knows a great deal about the medicinal qualities of weeds.
I see this as a medicine chest. Just looking at this, I'm just getting excited thinking about all the medicines I can make out of it. Look, there's nettle, there's wild garlic, there's just all sorts of things here.
Herbal treatment is the oldest form of medicine in the world. Human use of wild plants goes back at least 70,000 years. Here's our friend the nettle. So this gallium, or our sticky willy would call that down south, you could combine those two together?
Those two are a really good combination. Nettle, cleavers and dandelion were the 3 herbs that were used as spring tonics. The idea being that they were some of the first herbs that came through in the early spring, and after a winter of preserved meats and salted foods, no refrigeration of course, you needed something to cleanse a system.
It was time to turn my hand to a weed tonic.
Just going to use the leaves. So if I feed them in and you
turn... So I just literally just turn the...
Just turn the hand.
OK. Herbal medicine isn't just used for things like indigestion. The seeds of milk thistle are the only known antidote to death cap mushroom poisoning. OK, should we try some gallium in there? So I'm going to get up in the morning and have a cup of dandelion and nettle tea, and that's going to help me in which way?
It's going to help with your impending arthritis. The cleavers are good for skin problems, and dandelion, fantastic bowel herb, a mild diuretic, and it's used for joint problems, for arthritis and rheumatism.
Well, I'm going to take the dive and see how this tastes. Oh, all right, circling. I can taste the nettle, I can taste the dandelion. It's not bad. It's all right. A little bit bitter, but...
It's interesting that you say it's bitter, because that's where the whole aperitif came from, the idea of having something bitter before a meal to stimulate digestion.
Interesting. Well, I think that's perfectly easy to drink. We had always known weeds could be useful. But then something happened in the 1940s that made us realise how unexpectedly beautiful they can be. The bombing of London during the Blitz had a strange side effect. 40,000 Londoners were killed. 1.5 million were left homeless, and 600 acres of the city were reduced to rubble. But something else happened too. On May the 3rd, 1945, the Times ran a front-page story recording a strange consequence of the Blitz. At the Savoy Chapel, just off London's Strand, one of Britain's most eminent botanists used a public lecture to describe this extraordinary phenomenon. The beautiful and unexpected growth of weeds on London's bleak bomb sites. Most bomb sites were awash with yellow and purple. Imagine what an incredible sight that must have been. This was the biggest dig over ever, and the weeds weren't going to miss out. Weeds' ability to regenerate and bring life where there was none was not lost on the inhabitants of the ruins of London. These weeds were truly welcomed. One Londoner in particular was paying close attention. The man who delivered the lecture was Sir Edward Salisbury, a respected scientist who happened to be passionate about weeds. During the Blitz, he travelled to numerous bomb sites and identified a total of 127 different species of weed. The most common was roseberry willow herb. Native to Britain since the glaciers, the plant was not very common until the Blitz gave it an unexpected opportunity. It suddenly spread rapidly across the bomb sites and beyond, as each plant produced about 80,000 seeds. It also liked burnt ground and took nutrients from the ash. The plant is a perfect example of how weeds bring life to otherwise desolate or damaged environments. They wait patiently for the right opportunity to prevail. Sir Edward continued his research into weeds when in 1943 he became director of the largest and most important botanical research centre in the world, Kew Gardens. He wrote a book detailing his sometimes rather strange experiments with weeds. It remains a touchstone for botanists to this day. Sir Edward Salisbury, like most plantsmen, was eccentric, and it wasn't enough for him simply to find, identify and log the plants he was interested in. He was fascinated by the resilience and mobility of weeds, so he set up an experiment to find out how weed seeds behaved in the wind. I'm going to recreate one experiment to find out if the results still hold good. In the test, Salisbury dropped seeds from a height of 9 feet in order to record how long they took to reach the ground in a windless environment. Sir Edward's experiment entailed collecting the seeds of plants he was interested in, such as roseberry willow herb, buddleia and taxarum. He then took a ladder and would climb up to the height of 9 foot and release each type of seed. The time it took to get from his hand to the floor would determine how easily this seed was wafted and spread around the city or environment it was growing in. Because the longer they took to fall to earth, the further afield they could spread in the real world. It's Taxarum officinale, or the dandelion. 2, 3, 4, about 5, 6, about 6 seconds. And this is Buddleia Davidii. Just looking about 3, 4 seconds here. What's impressive about this plant, it's just the sheer numbers on the raceme. Now this one is Oxford ragwort. Finding out about plants like this really does bring out the eccentric in you. I'm sure Sir Edward had a great time doing it, and I can see why, to be honest. Now that's beautiful, look at that. And that is taking about 16 to 17 seconds, proving that Sir Edward's work was on the money, really. But at the same time as Sir Edward was carrying out his painstaking experiments in the 1940s to put weeds on the map, other scientists were hell-bent on destroying them. Wartime research by the Nazis into nerve gas had a peacetime spin-off. The first pesticides and herbicides were based directly on research conducted into sarin and other toxic agents. Things were about to get very bad for weeds. In the post-war rush to maximise food production in austerity Britain, weeds started being destroyed on an industrial scale.
Into battle against the foreign invader. That was the watchword of an armoured division on parade at Richmond last week.
As a result, the weeds that had always reduced crop yields were banished.
Have already been protected.
Before the 1940s, useless weeds sometimes amounted to 1/3 of the total harvest in any one field.
As this is highly inflammable, 2 men carrying fire extinguishers have to be on hand throughout the operation.
Herbicides allowed wheat farming to become big business for the first time. And wheat turned into our leading source of vegetable protein, used in everything from pasta to beer. We thought we had achieved the ultimate victory in our war on weeds. But the countryside has paid the price. In the last 50 years, Britain has lost 98% of its flower-rich meadows due to the production of arable crops like wheat. We are only now starting to realise what we may have lost when we banished weeds from our fields and created a monoculture. Dr. Jonathan Storkey has studied the unforeseen consequences of the chemical warfare revolution.
Well, what's happened since the 1950s is as the production of agriculture has become more intensive, we've used more fertilisers, more herbicides and pesticides, and also we're growing much less kinds of crops. We're basically growing winter wheat that we can see behind us and winter oilseed rape. So we've lost the diversity in the cropping and we're growing those crops more intensively. And what that's done is it's contracted the available niche or the habitat space that other species can use to grow and persist. And so we now have quite a number of rare arable weeds like cornflower and corncockle that have disappeared from fields. But the second thing that has happened is that the overall amount of resource for wildlife in the environment has decreased. So we're losing species at all trophic levels. But also it's important because some of that biodiversity does helpful things, like pollinators pollinate crops, some of the natural enemies control the aphids in the crops. So we need to have some biodiversity in the environment. It's not good enough just to have wall-to-wall crops. So if I was doing a survey of...
So without some weeds in fields, we lose essential insect pollinators, as Jonathan showed me.
What species we're growing in the different parts of the field. So we've got quite a nice range of species in this quadrat.
See, we recognise the dandelion. What's its role here?
They're providing pollen and nectar resources, particularly early in the season, for pollinators to use as resources.
So bees, very important to the ecosystem.
Bees and butterflies, yep.
And we've got, like, this is a hogweed here, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a couple of umbellifers in the verge. There's the hogweed, and then there's also the cow parsley, and things like hoverflies, particularly like those small white flowers. And again, the hoverflies are important in the ecosystem for controlling crop pests later in the season.
So they go out and help clear up the insects we don't really want there.
Providing a mosaic of resources through the season. So we want to have the resources here at the right time to encourage the natural enemies later in the season.
So a small sacrifice for our small friends here, really?
Yeah, we're talking maybe 6 metres at the edge of the field, have reduced herbicide, have reduced fertiliser, and just provide an opportunity, provide some habitat for some of these species to persist and thrive.
And the massive irony of all this is that the very crop that has become a monoculture at the expense of weeds, wheat, was once a weed itself. Plant scientist Professor Nick Harbord of Oxford University has researched the moment a weed became wheat.
About 500,000 years ago, there was spontaneously in the wild, nothing to do with human beings, a cross-hybridization, a cross-pollination, if you like, between 2 wild grass species. So one can imagine that humans were cultivating this wheat in a field, and then, by chance, a weed was growing within that field. And there was, again, a spontaneous hybridization event between the cultivated wheat and this wild grass that was growing in this imaginary field. The whole process made a plant that was bigger and more vigorous. And as a result of that, we ended up with the wheat crop that we all grow and feed off today.
Nick can recreate exactly how wheat and weeds crossbred in a lab today.
What I'm doing here is getting an immature flower head from cultivated wheat.
So this is a cultivated wheat, and down here next to it, that is...
This is a wild wheat species. The idea then is to take a flower and open it so that you pull away what are called bloom cases, which is what I'm doing now. So I think that's fine now. And now we move on to this wildflower, and you can see that's very, very different. And what we're looking for now are anthers that are shedding pollen. There we are, that's an anther. And then you come back to the flower where we were before, and then you spread the pollen on the female part of the flower like that.
So what we've done there then, Nick, is recreated in a laboratory situation what happened 10 to 12,000 years ago between our domesticated wheat and our wild goat grass, yeah? So we've created it here. They would have cross-pollinated exactly the same way, but in more natural conditions.
Yeah, exactly right, yeah.
Weeds helped us out millennia ago, and now scientists in the 21st century have turned to weeds once again for one of the most important discoveries in plant biology ever. It could save lives by creating a super wheat. It all took place here, at the John Innes Institute in Norwich.
So, come on in, Chris. You need to sterilise your feet here.
OK, so this means we're not bringing in anything nasty from the outside.
That's right. Thrips or viruses or anything else that might come in.
Dr Alison Smith is head of metabolic biology here. This is the first time I've ever dressed up to go and see a weed.
We look after our weeds very carefully here.
Alison's team have been studying a small common weed called Arabidopsis or Thalcress, which is now used as the model to map the DNA of all plants on the planet.
Well, this weed is incredibly easy for us to work on, and all plant scientists almost in the world take information from this weed, and many plant scientists only work on this little weed. The reason why it's really useful is that, like a lot of weeds, it goes from seed to seed really quickly, so we can get through lots and lots of generations, and that makes it easy for us to do genetic studies to understand how the weed behaves and what all of its genes are doing. But also, about 20 years ago, plant scientists got together, and at that time they were working on lots and lots of different plants, and they decided, let's work on one plant together that can become the model from which we can develop our understanding of plants. So about the same time as we were sequencing the human genome, we started to sequence the genome of this little weed. So in 2000, we got the entire gene sequence of this weed. All of the genes are known, the same time as we understood the human genome.
So really then, this small weed is a blueprint for all plants.
This is the model for all plant life, that's right.
But the sequencing of the Arabidopsis genome is not just for the sake of it. Alison and her 600 colleagues are unlocking the secrets of the plant's success, like its speedy growth rate and its hardiness, and are transferring those abilities to the crops that matter to us, like wheat. This is one of the most important discoveries in plant biology ever, where one of the humblest weeds could save millions of lives around the world.
That's right, yep.
Now, we've seen our magic weed, and you've got this genetic blueprint. How do you take that blueprint and apply it to arable crops like this wheat?
Well, we can start to tackle, using this blueprint, some of the real problems that we have with our crops, like disease, for example. Our crops are quite susceptible to some diseases. We've been able to breed for that, but we haven't known what genes we're breeding for. In Arabidopsis gets diseases as well. We can understand exactly how it's resistant to those diseases. We know what genes it needs, and we can say, right, where are those genes in wheat? Can we make sure that our new wheats have the genes that make them resistant to disease? Another example would be how the wheat exactly makes its seeds. Obviously, this is the really important bit of wheat. This is what we eat. It's human food. We understand a bit about the process of how these little seeds are formed, but in Arabidopsis, we understand in absolute molecular detail how those seeds are made. And that helps us to understand how we'd make better seeds, bigger seeds, more nutritious seeds in wheat. We can apply that knowledge in wheat.
Well, I know scientists don't like to be too dramatic, but I'm going to be, because simply what I found out, weeds could play a big role in arable crops like wheat, or even maybe the future of humanity.
I think it was the starting point for what has to be a revolution in our crops, a revolution in understanding how they work and making them work better, and doing that fast. It's taken our ancestors, millennia to get to this point. We can't afford to take the next step in millennia. We have to take it in tens of years or less. And in order to do that, you're absolutely right, the information from Arabidopsis has been the key to pushing us forward.
It's the resilience of weeds and the insights they give us into helping crops survive that makes them among the most useful plants on the planet.
Usefulness may not be just the obvious usefulness of, oh, how does it do us humans good? Take some horehound, it'll cure your cough. Mint tea, good for indigestion, things like that. It may be a much bigger ecological usefulness. Weeds come in to disturb ground to try and green it up. So they're doing one of life's basic functions to try and turn sterile, bare earth into green vegetation. And we should pause to think about that before we just automatically hoik them out.
This is nature at its most fundamental. Greening over gaps is what weeds have done since the beginning of time. Creating new life, a process called succession. Here is one place where you can see this in action, and no one who really observes what they do can fail to be grateful to weeds. Built in 1853, with money from sugar and the slave trade, Porthalloch is a Victorian mansion on the west coast of Scotland. The house was abandoned in 1958. Since then, it's become a perfect example of plants reclaiming the voids created by man. These grounds would have been tended to by 10 gardeners. But that was a long time ago, and now nature's moved in and nature's doing the gardening. "50 years ago, weeds were the brave new pioneers. Their rapid life cycle bringing vital nutrients and organic matter to the surroundings. Now, these are plants whose only agenda is to set seed. And I've got a perfect little example here with this bittercress. This really is a frontline weed. It's only got one thing on its mind, which is get its roots down, get its flower up, set its seed, get its next generation growing. But it does a very, very important job because the life cycle's so quick. It rots down, forms organic material, provides a bit of humus, and creates a substrate of soil, which you can see here on this windowsill. This then allows other plants to move in. During the first winter, perennial weeds with root systems like the bramble would have begun to get the upper hand here. Their roots breaking up the ground, letting in crucial elements such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. The rubisaur bramble is a really aggressive coloniser. The backward sloping spikes allow it to grow over anything in its way. And it has a thick carpet of roots, and on those roots at their apex is a cambium cap that enables it to drill through the soil. And in times of austerity, like when the weather's bad, or if it gets attacked by a gardener's spade, it's these roots that enable this weed to survive. Now this plant is a very important member of the environment, and you may recognise it as it's a weed in your lawn, clover, but it belongs to the legume family. And on its roots has a special bacteria called rhizobium which fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere. And all the plants around it can swap this nitrogen for sugars. And also, this whole process nourishes the soil. This plant is a highly prized member of the process of succession. And down here on the floor, which was once probably a beautiful room in this mansion, here we have bracken. And this is a perennial that has died back over the winter, and its leaves and all its debris are forming this lovely substrate which is very rich in humus and nutrient. And you can see this works because the moss has moved in behind it, and as we move through time, eventually the small saplings of trees start to grow. And finally, the long-term species move in, the kings of nature, like the beech and the oak. And this beautiful specimen is just sitting here, waiting its time, being nursed by these big willows, which will eventually die out. The beech will then grow up, put out its canopy, and succession will be complete, and the weeds would have done their job. We've waged a war on weeds because these tenacious plants have annoyed us. They don't fit in with our plans to confine them within the boundaries of our gardens and our fields. Weeds don't recognise boundaries, only opportunity, and they are engineered to be born survivors. Some that were once welcomed with open arms have now been rebranded as alien invaders and condemned to extermination. But our relationship with weeds will change again as we understand more about them. And the more we learn about exactly how they work, the more it becomes obvious how essential they are to the life cycle. Although it might pain us to admit it, without weeds, we would be in trouble. Or, as Gerard Manley Hopkins put it in his 1918 poem, Inversnade, what would the world be once bereft of wet and of wildness? Let them be left. Oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet.